let's start Hebrews. What we're going to do today is a lot of the background information, authorship, where the book comes from, who it's being written to, who wrote it, date when it was written, and a possible background. And that way we can get a better understanding, because as we understand why the book was written, who it was written to, we'll be able to better understand what it's actually saying. So let's start a little bit with the background, most important of which is, who's the author? Well, one of the things about Hebrews is not only one of the most beautiful books, intricately written books of the New Testament, it's also one of the most mysterious, because there's a lot of questions about it. And the first question is, who wrote it? The generally accepted position is that we don't know. And there are all kinds of theories. So let's first start just looking at the evidence. And if you take a look at your handout, I have summarized some of the early citations about what the early church fathers thought about that. This is important because they were the people closest to the author. Now, the first citation from Hebrews is in a person named Clement of Rome, about 100 AD, and he used Hebrews a lot, which is really nice, because one thing we know, that Hebrews was written by that point. We know, for example, it's not like some of the other books like the Gospel of Thomas or things that claim to be from the New Testament and are not, because they're second century writings. We know Hebrews clearly is not in that category, because Clement was using it about 100 AD, therefore it had to be written before that. Although he uses the book a lot, he never actually mentions the author. So it helps us with dating the book, doesn't help us much with the authorship. Paneas is the late 2nd century. He had this to say about it. Now, as our blessed presbyter Paneas has said, since the Lord himself was sent by the Almighty as an apostle to the Hebrews, Paul, being an apostle to the Gentiles on account of modesty, does not subscribe himself as the apostle to the Hebrews, both out of reverence for his Lord, because being a preacher and an apostle to the Gentiles by kind surrogation, he wrote to the Hebrews. So that's Clement of Alexandria, cited by Eusebius, referring back to the late 2nd century person, Paneas. He gives us Paul as the author. Clement, also 2nd century. Paul is the author of the epistle to the Hebrews, and that, as it was said, addressed to the Hebrews. It was written in the Hebrew language, but that Luke carefully translated, gave it to the Greeks, whence the same coloring style is found in the Acts of the Apostles. The inscription Paul to the Apostles is probably added, probably not added, because writing to Hebrews who were prejudiced against him and suspected him, he would very prudently not have deferred to them by reading it, by prefixing his name. So Clement also says it was Paul, but that Paul wrote it in Hebrew and that Luke translated it into Greek. A couple of issues with that. Also, he says that Paul didn't put his name on it because the Hebrews wouldn't have read it because of that. There's some issues with that theory. One, Hebrews shows no signs of actually being translated. And when you do a translation, there's certain things you can, scholars can look for to see whether this was a work that was translated or not. And Hebrews shows no signs of that. So, pretty clearly, he's wrong there. Also, the idea that Paul would not have put his name to it because he would not have wanted the Hebrews to be prejudiced against him, it also has problems, because as we read through this, they very clearly know who the author is. And in fact, when we get to the end, it's very clear that they were friendly with the author. So there's no reason for the author not to have ascribed his name, because they already knew who he was. Origen, late 2nd century, has a quote, but this quote is disputed. Some cite Origen's statement that when it comes to who wrote Hebrews, only God knows. And they interpret that as being Origen saying nobody really knows who wrote Hebrews. David Allen Black has pointed out that Origen had already previously cited Paul as the author. And for example, in Africanus 9, for the author of the epistle to Hebrews, speaking of the prophets and what they suffered, they were stoned and they were sawed asunder, they were slain by the sword. Someone hard-pressed by this argument may have recourse to the opinion that those who reject this epistle as not being from Paul, against whom I must at some other time use other arguments to prove that it is Paul's. So Origen pretty clearly thought that Paul was the author. Black understands that statement of only God knows as saying, he says, it is well-intentioned but incorrect. It was only in the reference to the identity of the penman that Origen wrote, in truth, God knows. In light of this fact, any further attempt to use Origen's words to support of an agnostic position on the authorship of Hebrews is not to quote Origen, but to misquote him. So the best we can say is that when it comes to Origen, there's some dispute. He's clearly got some passages where it seems to say that Paul was the author, and then he has some passages where there's at least some question as to whether he's saying. As the idea of a penman, we do know that most of the writers of the New Testament use secretaries or their fancy word amanuensis. For example, in Romans, at the end of Romans, there's a statement where it says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, also greet you. Well, we know Paul wrote Romans, but Tertius was the penman. And so Dr. Black's argument at this point is that when it comes to the penman, we don't know who wrote it. So as we go on, others argue that Tertullian, that it was Barnabas. Augustine and Jerome tentatively saw it as Paul. As we move on into later times, there are other people citing different works. We also know the earliest collections that we have of Paul's writings place Hebrews there. And generally, it was accepted by the Eastern Church, but questioned by the West, and particularly questioned in Rome. From the 4th to the 16th century, it was pretty universally accepted that Paul was the author. Luther, however, questioned that and thought Apollos might have written the letter. And since then, many others have been suggested. Barnabas, Luke, Clement, Sevilius, Apollos, Philip, Priscilla, Jude, Silas, Timothy, Epaphras, and Mary have all been proposed as authors. Which is why it's generally accepted that we don't know who wrote it. Last major defense of Paul's authorship was a man named William Leonard, scholar, who wrote in 1939. So, like I say, we look at the external evidence. The earliest people either didn't cite it, the author, or cited it as Paul, but then there was some disputes about it. How about the internal evidence? Well, whoever wrote this letter had to be well versed in Jewish law and custom, because it's not only referred to, it's a key point within the letter. He was also clearly known to his readers. We said, 13, 18 through 19, pray for us, for we are sure that we have a clear conscience and a desire to live honorably in every way, especially ask you to do this so that we may be brought back to you sooner. So whoever wrote it is asking for prayers that they may return to whoever it was written to. Also, whoever wrote it knew Timothy. 13:23, you should know that our brother Timothy has been set free. If he comes soon, he will be with me when I see you. So again, this is a companion or traveling person who was familiar with Timothy. So we know at the time, both Timothy and the writer were in different locations from the reader, because the writer, Timothy, was hoping to come to the writer, and then the writer and Timothy were hoping to come to the readers. When we look at the closing of the letter, it's very similar to the closing of Paul's letters. The themes and teachings unique and does not fit easily into Paul's teachings. So, some questions there. There's many themes. That's one of the things about Hebrews is there's many things that are taught in this letter that are taught nowhere else. It's not that it's teaching a different theology, but it's taking up issues and things that are not mentioned anywhere else. So, finally, one other thing is the style is markedly different from Paul's writings. Paul is very much a practical type of person, and he writes in a kind of a Pauline style that's very abrupt. The style of Hebrews is extremely literary. It's flowing. It's probably the most elegant part of the New Testament. So people notice a very different style from the rest of Paul's writings. Now, if the early church fathers seem to center in on Paul as the author, why is it rejected? And there are 5 reasons given why it's rejected. First, that it's anonymous. Paul always began his letters with the normal introductory, A to B, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, writing to, and this letter doesn't start that way. 2, differences in style. They said the style of Hebrews is markedly different from the style of Paul's letters. The absence of Paul's personal experience found in much of his writings. Paul very frequently refers to his own experience and uses that as a way of teaching, and that doesn't occur here. Different themes. These are not themes that are taken up in Paul's letters, but then, as we said, they're not taken up in any of the New Testament writings. Finally, Hebrews 2:3, where it says, "This salvation was confirmed to us by those who heard him," talking about Jesus. And Paul, it's argued, would not have said that this was written by a second-generation Christian, not a first-generation Christian. And so the argument is that this would not have included Paul. For example, in Galatians 1:2, Paul writes, "I did not receive it from any man, nor was taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation of Jesus Christ." And the argument is that excludes Paul as the author. So, I happen to believe Paul is the author. So how do I reconcile those 5 reasons with the fact that I still believe he's the author? 1, the opening greeting was a standard for all letters. It wasn't peculiar to Paul. All New Testament letters began that way. And so whoever broke the pattern and did not include a normal opening was breaking the pattern. Paul could have done that just as much as anybody else could have done that. More important, the reason the pattern was broken seems to be to focus directly and immediately on Jesus Christ. And again, I see no reason why Paul could not have decided he wanted to focus on Jesus Christ and exclude himself. As for differences in style and vocabulary, yeah, they're markedly different. But as, for example, D.A. Carson said, who would reject the authorship of Paul, that differences in vocabulary, Greek style, and rhetoric cannot in themselves disprove Pauline authorship. Particularly when you put in the role of an amanuensis or a secretary. Right? We don't know exactly what that was. For some people, it would have been literal dictation. For other people, it would have been the summation of themes. I see no reason, and in fact I would argue it's very likely that Paul used an amanuensis and that it was most likely Luke who was the amanuensis. Because the style here shows marked similarities between Luke's style and also marked similarities between the pastorals. I believe what happened is that the earlier letters by Paul were written with some amanuensis, but by the time you get to the pastoral letters, Luke was the amanuensis, And that's the influence we see. We see Luke's influence in the pastoral letters and in Hebrews. How about number 3, absence of Paul's spiritual experience? Well, if he took himself out of the picture in the opening of the letter to highlight strictly on Jesus, why couldn't he have done that throughout the rest of the letter as well? One of the marked features of Hebrews is that it is focusing on Jesus and who Jesus is. And Paul could have done that as much as anybody else. And finally, Hebrews 2:3, second generation Christian. It's important to remember Paul was not part of the 12 disciples. And so, yes, he had direct revelation from God, but he would have also, remember, he went off and studied for 12 years before he began his ministry. So, who did he learn from? He learned from those who were there. So I don't see this as excluding Paul at all. So, why do people come up to different theories on this thing? Why am I a believer in Paul and, for example, our pastor doesn't believe Paul's the author? Right? Does that mean I'm a better Christian and he's not? No, it's just because we give different weightings to different evidence. And so, for example, one of the key important differences is how much value do we give to the early church fathers? I tend to give them a lot of value. Right? Skeptics of Paul being the author tend to discount them. Because if we look at the early church fathers, yeah, it's not universal, but it's pretty clear that they predominantly come down on Paul's side. How important is that lack of a traditional opening? I don't see it as important at all. How important are the stylistic differences? I don't think they're irrelevant, but I think actually they're accounted for by thinking about Luke as the amanuensis, but that's a big factor. The other thing is the relevance of modern evidence versus old evidence. One of the reasons that the early church fathers is rejected is because there's a fascination with the new, and therefore the old church fathers are discounted. And I think part of it is that, when you start studying the New Testament, there's a whole bunch of stuff to study. And so when you open up your textbooks and you start going through your textbooks, right? Your textbooks present the common consensus view. And the common consensus view is that Paul didn't write it. We don't know who wrote it. Well, how many people stop and actually question that? And it just sort of carries on from generation to generation to generation. And I think that's a large part of it, is that it's just kind of gotten in there and people don't really go back and question it. One of the things about this is that because the author, be it Paul or anybody else, was putting Jesus up as number one, to some extent the author isn't as important here as it would be in other books. Because what's the focus? The focus is on Jesus. So I believe Paul's the author because that seems to be the consensus of the early church fathers. And I think they were probably in a better position to know than we were. And I think some of the reasons put forward that he wasn't don't really stand up to critical evaluation. But whatever conclusion you reach on this, the important part is that the emphasis of this letter is going to be on Jesus. Now, like there's ambiguity about who wrote it, there's also ambiguity about who it was written to, although I don't think it's quite as much. First, it's pretty clear that they were Christians and that they were very familiar with the Jewish religion. We know that in 6:10 that they had helped others, that in 2:3 they had not been original followers of Jesus, in 10:32 that they had suffered persecution but not to the point of shedding blood, in 12:4 that they were approaching a crisis, that they had been visited by Paul or the author, whoever the author was, that they were told to greet your leaders. It seems to indicate that Paul was writing to a group that was a smaller section of a much larger group. Because, greet your leaders implies that there were leaders there to greet. So he wasn't writing to the church as a whole, but to a subset in an area. And there are the references to Timothy, so these people knew Timothy as well. So there have been two major proposals. One is Rome, and the other is Palestine. Currently, Rome is the dominant view, and it's supported by the use of the referred to as title. There's a title used in this letter. The Greek word is similar to the title, and the same as the title that was used in the church in Rome. Also, Hebrews 13:24. Those from Italy send you their greeting. Now, this is ambiguous. It could refer to people who were from Italy, who had gone over to wherever they were, and now were sending their greeting back to the Italians in Rome. Right? So those from Italy send you their greetings, which would tend to indicate a Roman origin. And I think that's one of the big reasons it was for a long time believed that Rome was the author. On the other hand, there's no reason to conclude that they were from Italy there. I mean, they could have been Italy anywhere. And in fact, Moser has searched out all the uses of those from, right? Hoi apo, for those who are interested in the Greek, to the 7th century, and the tendency is to refer to the place where the author was. So, if you say those from send their greeting, it would tend to say that's where the author was, and which would actually indicate that Paul was in Rome, not that the letter was sent to Rome. That brings us to Palestine. Again, this is the view supported by the early church fathers. It's also supported by the internal evidence of the emphasis on the Jewish practices. If you're going to write a lot about Jewish practices, it seems to be you're writing to people who know about them, and where's a better place for those people to be than in Palestine? Right? There's no mention of the Gentile-Jewish controversy that occurred in a lot of other areas, but wasn't very strong in Palestine because everybody was Jewish. No church claimed the letter, which is significant. Much of Palestine was destroyed by the Romans right after this. So if Palestine was destroyed, the church was destroyed, there would be a church there to claim that this letter was sent to them. And against Palestine origin, the level of Greek used, that they cited the Septuagint instead of the Hebrew Old Testament. And again, Hebrews 2:3, that they were second-generation Christians. Okay. But again, were there second-generation Christians in Palestine? Yeah. Where the Old Testament, the Septuagint, we know, was actually used a lot in Israel, even though they had the Hebrew. And the level of Greek, that just means he's writing to educated readers. So none of those really stand up as a real reason. Now, to me, the most likely group, I would argue, would be former priests. Josephus mentioned in his histories that there were 20,000 priests in Israel. Acts 6:7 says, so the word of God continued to spread, and a number of disciples in Jerusalem continued to grow rapidly. Even a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. So we know that after the resurrection, as the gospel began to spread, a large number of priests, who were clearly to be second-generation Christians, came to the faith. And we know from persecution that they went to places like Antioch. And that, if Paul is writing to these priests, that would account for a lot of things. It would account for the emphasis of the Jewish priestly system. It would account for the fact that Jesus is portrayed as the high priest. So it actually makes a lot of sense that he's writing to priests who had become Christians in the faith. So I think evidence, even though it's a consensus view, I think the evidence for Rome is very weak, especially considering the work of Moser. And I think the arguments for Palestine, possibly even Jerusalem or Antioch, are very strong. So I would think that he's clearly writing to Palestine and very likely writing to priests. So as for the date, we get a little bit better there. It's quoted by Rome, it was quoted by Clement of Rome, so it must have been written before 96 AD. If Paul was the author, it would have had to have been written before AD 65 when he was killed. Key aspect here is there's no mention of the destruction of the temple. Now this is key because it would make the argument that he's trying to make. The argument he's making is that Jesus is a better sacrifice and a better offering than was done under the temple system. Well, if the temple system had been destroyed, it'd just be the so to speak the nail in the coffin that would make his argument, and yet it's not mentioned. The most obvious reason why it would not be mentioned is because it had not occurred yet. So the fact that the temple's not mentioned would argue for an early date. Therefore, if we see the impending crisis that they were under the effect of as the revolt, which was to break out in 66 and run through 70 AD, then it is very likely we were looking at a group of priests who were being troubled because of the growing unrest. So, as a possible background, if you look at the other handout there I have for you, the possible background, in AD 65, Paul was nearing the end of his last missionary journey. Having recently returned from Spain, it was a time of unrest. Emperor Claudius had recently died and Nero was now the new emperor. In Palestine, the Roman prefect Albinus had been recalled for incompetence the previous year after having ruled for only 2 years. His replacement, Florus, however, was even worse. The Jews were growing weary of Roman domination and the rule of corrupt leaders. As such, there was growing unrest, which would soon break out to open rebellion and war, which we know took place in AD 66. In such a climate, many Jewish believers, perhaps even former priests, were torn between their newfound faith and their homeland. Many probably felt that they were abandoning the faith of their fathers just when they were most needed. As such, some were returning to Judaism. It was probably to just such a group that Paul wrote Hebrews. This would account for the contrasting themes of Jesus as the fulfillment of the law and the warnings against apostasy and returning back to Judaism.
I'm not 100% sure what the word apostasy means. I've heard it, but I don't really know what it means.
Fall away.
Fall away, okay.
Yeah. It means to leave the faith, to fall away. Now, as far as the structure of the letter, again, in these classes, structure and content and format outlines are very important. There's been two main views. There'd be an introduction, a postscript, along with doctrinal part and a practical part. What John Brown called the great doctrine, and then called the great duty. And he splits those at 10:18 and 10:19. And that's probably the majority of you. Problem with that is that the two sections are really not very clearly defined. And we'll see that there's awfully a lot of duty in the first part and a lot of doctrine in the second part. So this division between theology and duty doesn't really line up very good. Kumo put it into 3 sections. F.F. Bruce and Leon Morris just label it a complete patchwork. The Jesuit scholar Van Hoyle sees a chiastic structure within the letter, and that's going to be the approach that I take here. In fact, the more and more that I've studied this letter, the more convinced I am that it is extremely carefully written and that it has a chiastic structure. And so if you take a look at your outline, you'll see that there are 8 sections. The section 8 is basically just the final words or concluding. So, and actually when we get there, you'll see that it really is a kind of a closing off of the letter, what Paul would normally do at the end of his letters. So that leaves, in terms of the general content of the letter, that leaves 7 sections, and those 7 sections form into a chiasmus. 3 leading in, the 4th section being the central section, or the great work of Jesus, and then 3 leading out. And if you notice those sections, the sections themselves are fairly well balanced. We see the introduction, the superiority of Jesus, Jesus is the high priest, the great work of Jesus, accessing the work, making straight paths, and then finally the conclusion. And if you look at section 4, the great work of Jesus, you'll see that it is also in a chiastic format, starting with a preliminary exhortation and a closing exhortation, and then the central part, a better priesthood, a better offering, and a better result. So I think the letter actually works itself out quite nicely. In fact, if you take, for example, go to your detailed outline and take a look at the great work of Jesus, and take a look at the preliminary exhortation. You'll notice that that has 7 steps. Now skip ahead to the closing exhortation. You'll see that has 7 steps. And in fact, the steps are actually pretty close. In the first one, it's you are still infants. In the closing one, it's your new status. The second one, in the preliminary exhortation, go on to maturity. In the closing exhortation, draw nearer to God. The preliminary exhortation, impossible to renew. The closing exhortation, if you keep sinning, there's no sacrifice. Both of which are then followed by analogies. So, this letter is extremely carefully written. And it's in the form of one large chiasmus. And the very center point of the chiasmus is 9:11 through 12. If you want to know what Hebrews is all about, you can just go to 9:11 through 12, and that's the central point of the letter. The true offering. Now, as we go through the upcoming weeks and months, we'll see this work out in detail, but that's the outline that we're going to follow. And at least for this class. So, if you summarize the points of this letter, when we're looking at this letter, we're talking about the authorship, it's not agreed on universally. I happen to think it was Paul, but that is admittedly a minority view today. It used to be the majority view, but today it's a minority view. I believe it was written to Jewish high priests who lived in Palestine. Mainly they weren't high priests, but it seems the content of the letter seems to suggest that is a very likely possibility. I believe it was written, since I believe it was written by Paul, I believe it was written before 65. I certainly believe whoever wrote it before the fall of the temple. Because I find it hard to believe, given the overall message, that the author would not have referred to the temple being destroyed had it been destroyed. And its purpose is, these were people who seemed to be looking to go back, Jewish Christians or Jewish even high priests looking to go back to Christianity or to Judaism because of the political turmoil within their country. They were so caught up in the day-to-day events and the outrages by the Romans, and they felt like here they were abandoning their country just as they were needed most. Because for a Jew, the concept of the country of Israel and the faith of Israel were intertwined. in a way that's not the case with Christianity. And so they felt like they were abandoning not only their faith but their country just when they were most needed, just at the edge of the revolt, which would start in 66 AD. And so Paul has written them a letter pointing out that they're not abandoning their faith by becoming a Christian. They're fulfilling their faith by becoming a Christian. And that Jesus is the true sacrifice, which would account for the overall message of the letter and for the periodic warnings that appear throughout the letter. However this letter, or whoever it was written by, it's very clear that this was extremely important to them. This letter is one of the most carefully written letters in the Bible, and is one of the most beautiful pieces of literature of all time. And whoever wrote it put a lot of time and effort and thought and care and concern into structuring this letter. This was an important message for them. This was a message that was not just to be done haphazardly and just a quick written off. Or, for example, the Corinthians had just sent a long list of questions. And so Paul, writes down a list of answers to each of their questions, is what we get, for example, in Corinthians. This was a thought out, detailed message, very carefully constructed. The types of literary features we find throughout this letter are not those that occur haphazardly. And so the author put a lot of thought into this. And that in and of itself makes Hebrews a very important book. This is something, whoever wrote it was putting a very important message, a very key and critical message, and something that we need to pay attention to. All right, that's pretty much the introduction to the letter. Next week, we will start out with chapter 1, verse 1, and see where we go from there. Any questions? Nope? All right. Let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer.